Hello, my name is Ted Hulsy. I'm Vice President of Marketing at eFolder and your host for today's event. Welcome to the eFolder Partner Chat. This webinar series brings together leading MSP partners for business-oriented discussions. Today we are joined by David Burke, partner at Network Doctor. David and I will discuss how Network Doctor built up a successful account management sales process to support their managed services business model. Let's look at, let's go through a couple housekeeping items before we look at the agenda. Today's session is being recorded. The recorded version of the webinar will be made available on eFolder's YouTube channel. We will also make copies of the slides available to those who registered for the event. With over 275 people registered for today's session, we put all participants in listen-only mode. You can enjoy the audio portion of today's event either by streaming it on your computer or by dialing in over the phone. Questions are strongly encouraged throughout. We have planned a special Q&A section at the end of today's discussion, but you may submit your questions as we go along, and we will try to address them on the fly. Today's presentation follows a logical flow. David and I will walk through the 5 key reasons you should start with account management when hiring your first salesperson. David will share his firsthand experiences and best practices learned from their journey. Finally, we will finish with an interactive portion of Q&A. So at this point, what I'd like to do is introduce our guest for today, David Burke. David, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay, great. So David, you are one of the partners in Network Doctor. Tell us a little bit about Network Doctor, when you guys were founded, what you guys specialize in, and where do you operate?
Sure. So we're based out of the New York City metro area. Myself and my partner, we started the company 13 years ago. Started out like many MSPs as sort of a part-time gig, and then it turned into something real. And as we built up the business, we turned towards managed services. I would say probably about 8 or 9 years ago, moving from break fix and hourly support. And today we're managing approximately 150 small mid-sized businesses across many different industries, and we have a staff of approximately 40 that are primarily based in New York City metro area, our main office in New Jersey, as well as we have an overseas office in Portugal.
Okay, and talk to us a little bit about the transformation to a managed services model. You know, when did you guys really get started with that, and what was the most challenging part of that?
Sure. You know, it's one of those things that you don't just flip a switch and it happens overnight. It's generally a progression. Certainly if you didn't start as a straight managed service provider, like I said before, many of us probably started off just doing hourly work and sending bills and hopefully getting paid for all the work that you submitted. And that's easier to do when you're smaller, and the person who's doing the work is also the person who's looking at the invoices, who's also the person that can answer questions about the invoices and so on. And this is a common scenario for a lot of MSPs that, you know, we're friendly with and have relationships with, and we have these types of conversations. So as I said, about 8 years ago, we got to a growth point where that person wasn't the same person across that, you know, the life cycle that I just described, and it became very difficult to really, I mean, one of the main drivers was to justify invoices. You'd have clients call up and say, hey, you know, this work was done. You have it on our bill for an hour and a half. I think it was really an hour. And then you'd have to go back, ask the tech who did the work, can you verify this, and so on and so forth. Time goes by and memories become fuzzier. And it ended up being that, you know, we were spending a day or two a month just talking to clients about invoices and going through it with them, and it became really tedious. So managed services existed, you know, prior to us, and obviously it's a lot more popular 8 years later. We finally got to a point where we just said, hey, let's open up the floodgates, so to speak, and provide unlimited support, give them a fixed price, and we'll see what happens. So the way we transitioned into that was taking our existing clients And it was really just, we try to make it really simple so we could do it quickly, and we would take an average of the amount of hours or dollar amount they were spending with us. We present it to them and say, hey, now you can call us as much as possible. We'll never have to have this conversation about what was done, how long it took, and so on and so forth, and they were happy about that too. Obviously, there was reservations from certain clients because it was a new engagement, and many of them we had been working with for 3-4 years prior to that. And our concern was that opening of floodgates. Are we going to get flooded with requests and people asking us stuff because they don't want to have to think about, well, I don't want to call because I don't want to get charged and it might be something silly. And then we quickly figured out that people don't do that. Business owners aren't really concerned or are looking to get the value by just making phone calls so that they're racking up hours. And once we did that, we really never looked back. So there's very few clients that we have that are on an hourly basis unless they meet a certain criteria. And we've been managed services ever since.
Great, and we met through HTG. I think we met during one of the peer group meetings when the vendors are invited in to kind of peer into the room and listen to what you guys are talking about. How has being in a peer group helped you guys kind of transform your business and grow?
So if you ask me versus my partner, Paul, we might give you slightly different answers, maybe vastly different answers. So we're really a part of two managed service peer groups. One is HTG and the other is something local. So I'm not as involved in the HTG, more nationwide presence, but I've attended a number of them, and that's where we met. For me, I think a lot of it has to do with validation. I leave a lot of those meetings feeling pretty good about where we are. I think a lot of business owners, they want more and they want to be able to do more, and sometimes you have a long day and you might reflect on the business and say, oh, we have to do better. And you focus on the things that you want to fix as opposed to some of the things you've achieved. So me speaking, I found that I walked out of those meetings feeling good about where we were, so it kind of recalibrated my perspective. I think Paul, who goes to the HTG ones, there's some value. He handles the finance side and some of the back-end stuff, and there's a lot of tips and tricks that he's picking up from there. But I think he would agree with me about the validation. That kind of early on, there's more to gain, and then you've gained, and towards on the backside, once you've gotten to a firm level, there's a responsibility to give back.
That's right, and I think it's all about kind of sharing. It becomes. Sometimes you're in desperate need of an answer to a problem or a challenge you're having in your business, or a technical solution to something that's maybe new and different you haven't faced before. But there's usually big rocks that business owners are trying to overcome. And I think the sales topic is one that lots and lots of MSP business owners are struggling with. And we met face-to-face in a meeting just about 1.5 to 2 years ago. And the discussion in the room at the peer group meeting was, how do I hire that first salesperson? And I kind of raised my hand, and you guys had given a good rundown of all these good things you were doing on the sales front. And I raised my hand and asked you, I said, hey, tell us about your first sales hire. And what was amazing to me is you then went into the description of what you guys did, and you said absolutely nothing about the person who was the first sales hire. And I think a lot of MSP business owners think that it's about getting lucky, finding that superhero, that superstar who's going to be that first successful sales hire, and then it's going to be smooth sailing from there. And that's exactly not what you said. You told us all about the process and foundation you laid in your business, and it was really about taking care of your installed base and putting account management resources there. And so that kind of inspired me. I blogged about what you shared. I've shared that with scores of business owners in the intervening 2 years, the story you told, and then there was really the genesis of today's webinar as well. So what I want to do is kind of change gears a bit and start talking about the 5 reasons. If for everybody in the audience, I want to remind you, first of all, if you have questions for David, please use the Q&A feature and type them in there. But we're going to go through the 5 reasons we really, believe that if you're an MSP business owner, if you're kind of stuck at that 10 or 12 employee range, you're trying to get higher levels of revenue growth, you're trying to get to Paul Dippel's, best-in-class revenue growth, best-in-class EBITDA margins. If you're trying to get there, you really got to crack the code on sales. And it means that somebody more than just the business owners and partners are doing the selling and really strategic account management. And so so kind of first concept, David, I want to get your kind of take on is, I have this idea that, and we talk about this at eFolder too. We do business with 3,000 MSP partners, and we talk about partners in the same way. The organizations that bring you recurring revenue, they're like an iceberg. And you see the tip of the iceberg above water, which is the initial agreement, the first product you sell, but it's really the massive opportunity is all of the things you can do together over time. And in the case of SMB clients, it's projects, it's upsell, it's putting in additional technologies. Can you kind of share your point of view on this concept?
Yeah, sure. So, you had asked before about the peer group meeting. So one of the things that I kept hearing over and over again was about salespeople, right? So when the moderators threw up, okay, let's put together an agenda, inevitably, every single meeting was, how do I find good salespeople, right? Mm-hmm. And whatever the format of these meetings are, when you went around the room and, each member of the group would say, here's what I'm faced with, everybody would give them feedback. You need to look for this, you need to do a hunter, and everybody had an opinion about it. But when it came to their turn, that was one of their challenges too. And that's probably been consistent in every single peer group meeting or any engagement that I've had with an MSP owner. And in a lot of different industries, not just in technology. It's really hard to find, right? Because we've all had those interviews and the person in front of you is presenting themselves as an all-star salesperson, and the question is, well, why are you leaving where you are? And you hear different answers, and sometimes it's legitimate, but generally, if you have a really bullish salesperson, you're not letting that person go unless they just want to make money that your industry or your business just can't provide. So it got me thinking, my background was actually in sales first in telecom, and then I got into IT. It got me thinking, like, does that exist? Yeah, it exists, but is it realistic to go after that? Am I going after, if you're using the 80-20 rule, or in this case, I would say it's probably 95-5 rule, are we putting too much effort in that 5% when there's a better way of going about it? So, hiring a good salesperson is not something that we said we're just not going to do. It's just something we choose not to proactively focus on in that traditional manner. So what we found, like you were saying, was successful is hiring account managers, real account managers, because a lot of the terms today, pardon my language, are bastardized in terms of what's a salesperson, business development, account management, service manager, and so on. But an account manager, in the sense, they're assigned the existing, a sect of the existing client base, and they're responsible for keeping those clients happy and maintain communications between operations and them, upselling. I tend to shy away from the word selling in general, because I like to think upselling really is a recommendation that's the client could use, not that selling is selling them always something they can't use, but if you have a server that's 5-6 years old and just not, the resources aren't there, you're basically providing them a value because it's something that they need to do. But providing that platform for them to come to you, or you to come to them as the account manager and say, hey, this is what we need to do, or this is what you need to expect in the future, in a year from now, 3 years, or what have you. And so the first thing that did was it really secured our relationships with our clients, because prior to that, again, like a lot of MSPs, the business owner becomes their primary point of contact, whether it's for technical issues or sales or these account management functions. And as you grow, that's just something you can't scale unless you really have a lot of business partners, which probably has its own challenges associated with it. So if you can somehow maintain a relationship, right, because you don't want to just basically walk off into the shadows and they never hear from you again. I don't think that that's healthy either. But have somebody do the day-to-day stuff and even go further than you could have gone as the business owner, that made for a great system and even a farm system for future salespeople if you wanted to go that route. So, I often compare it when I'm meeting with new prospects. I often tell them it's similar to an accounting firm or a law firm. In an accounting firm, you have, the partner that you deal with in the accounting firm, and depending on the size of the accounting firm, and then you might have the associate. And the associate's doing taking care of the taxes and preparing stuff. And the partner in the accounting firm is there for the relationship, maybe take you out for dinner, lunch, what have you. When you're dealing with big things like very serious stuff, they might come to you. When the client needs some TLC, you step in there. And that's really what we viewed as being a much more valuable component than spending a lot of time to try to find, I don't want to call it a unicorn because it does exist, but something that's a much rarer species.
Right, and I think let's kind of like let me kind of ask a question though about how you got ready to do that, because it really is all about scale, right? So I love the analogy of kind of the law firm or the accounting firm where you and Paul are the rainmakers, but you need somebody to look after the farm. I mean, because if you have 150 clients, that there's no possible way that you and Paul could be the person they would call for relationship discussion. So you need people to really farm the base. But you said when we met in that HTG meeting, you also talked about just preparing the ground, if you will, and you talked about how you kind of got lots of things about your product portfolio and services well defined and documented, so that you could hand off all this day-to-day stuff to these folks. So can you talk a little bit about that part of the journey?
Sure. So we're big fans of documentation and being consistent. So we built that's just something that's a part of my DNA, to make sure that there's some consistency and we're not running around and kind of reinventing the wheel every time. And as I was going to say, and then you asked the question, so it's the perfect segue to it. The other huge advantage is it gives the account manager or this individual an opportunity to learn the business, right, without kind of going out and selling. I don't really know what I'm selling. I hear very often I'm just pure sales. I'm a hunter. Once I get somebody interested and I get the contract signed, I move on. That, being in that role doesn't really give you much of an opportunity to understand technology. I think that our industry, just having somebody who's just straight sales and really can't advise and impress and so on, can't really be that effective. Again, I don't like to say anything with all certainties, but that's the general rule that I've seen. So by becoming account managers, they learn a lot along the way, right? They understand the products that, if they hear key points in the conversation, to say, hey, you know what? It makes sense to introduce this, right? Makes sense to go to cloud. It makes sense to use a certain security solution and so on. Whereas if you're doing straight sales and it's sort of, first impressions or lasting impressions, if you're not equipped to be able to discuss those things intelligently, you really can close the window on those opportunities, or certainly, make the gap in the window smaller. So we found it to be much more effective in terms of them learning, and really, again, it's important for anybody when they learn that there's some level of consistency. So as we introduced new products to offer clients, we made sure that, whether we had videos associated with them or it was well defined within our, the back end stuff, this is how much it costs, this is exactly what it does, these are the different levels or options available. This way, like you said, we didn't need to huddle up every time something needed to be offered or recommended or discussed.
Right, and I think I love it. I mean, there's two really dimensions to preparing your organization? I mean, I think there's a couple questions that have already hopped through into the Q&A log where everyone's looking for that silver bullet. This isn't, I mean, I think there's two real big points that need to be made here. First of all, if you look at yourself in the mirror as an MSP business owner, and you will probably say to yourself, I'm the best guy to sell what we have. And do you know why in most cases? Because there is so much stuff about your business, about what you do in terms of capabilities that's up in your head, and you haven't written it down. And it would be impossible for you to hand it off to somebody else to go out and sell and close business. So the reality here is that so much of getting prepared to actually have quota-carrying sales staff is about documenting what it is you do, the SLAs, the products, the scope of what you're going to do, you know, the key value propositions, the key problems you solve, and articulate those. And then, as David mentioned, you know, an account management role, it's a safer place naturally to inculcate the breadth of what you're doing, because you do so many different things. You probably have 40 to 60 vendor relationships. You have all these different types of technologies you can put into different clients, and inherently you've got to solve both of these problems, which is you've got to better document things so that you can build a sales organization that can sell without you. If you're out on vacation for 2 weeks, things cannot grind to a halt. You've got to have it documented, and then you've got to have a process by which you have people who ramp up in a reasonable amount of time to the whole scope of this relatively complicated business model.
Yep.
So, so let's talk a little bit about, and just so it's clear, Dennis wants to know, practically, are you going to tell us how to hire your first salesperson? And I think the point of the main thesis of today's discussion is don't start with a hunter. Start with account management. If you don't have anybody on your staff who carries a quota, and by quota carrying, what I mean by that is they have a base salary, plus they have a significant variable component to their compensation package, which is based upon the achievement of some revenue objective. That's what we mean by quota carrying. Might seem obvious, but a lot of that times that gets confused. And let's talk, I mean, I think just it's a truism that it's much easier to drive revenue out of your and keep and hold on to the clients you already have than it is to get a new one. But just let's dig in a little bit more here. David, talk about Network Doctor's account management team. How many do you have? How has that evolved over time? What was the profile of the first person that worked out? Talk a little bit about that, if you would.
Yeah. So, by the way, just one thing I wanted to mention. When you said, when a business owner goes on vacation, things can't grind to a halt. It's interesting you said that, because I think my aha moment was when me and Paul happened to take vacation at the same time, and we got back and things were, were working perfectly fine. So it's interesting you said that. That was one of our aha moments. Yep. So the way, first of all, the way the team works is, there's no set rule, 25 clients per account manager. It's really about the organization, how many users they are, how complex it is. So there's a level of, you have to put in some intelligence into it. It's not just like, one to you, one to you, one to you, two to you, two to you, two to you. We have 4 account managers. And also there's a level of them backing each other up. So there's that sense of camaraderie. And if one of those account managers is on vacation, somebody else can jump in. And the first time we hired somebody, we hired a salesperson, and I realized that they were really good at, when we went on meetings, taking notes, following through, making sure that the people internally on our teams were doing what they needed to do. And I saw that the new business, first of all, there was plenty of work for them, and they didn't have that much of an opportunity to focus on the new business stuff. And then we realized, hey, there's a lot of value in this. Now I can go on other sales meetings, not have to worry about sending the notes and the follow-up items and all that stuff. Somebody else is taking care of that. And like you said, the reality is there's nobody who's better at selling the product than you probably are. And I should say also, in terms of showing knowledge when you're in front of the client and, what you're capable of doing. Selling, there's different aspects of selling. There's the tenacity and the follow-up requirements and so on and so forth. And that's something somebody else can do by laying down a process for them. Say, after we meet, make sure you get out this note. If you don't hear from them in X amount of days, follow through with this and so on. So that's more not necessarily having to be suave and, a sweet talker. That's more mechanical and something that you can create. So once we realized how valuable that account manager was, then we got busier and we had to hire another account manager because the primary couldn't handle that, or the first one couldn't handle that, and they started to shed accounts to them. And that actually also freed up, the two most senior account managers are the ones that get assigned the new business. I think we could all agree most of our business comes through word of mouth and maybe advisors that we work with, partners that we work with. So that being said, once we get that in, right, we want to hand it to somebody else because there's a lot of work to be done as opposed to somebody just hitting the phones and calling one business after another business and go to networking groups and so on and so forth. So there was enough business there to keep them busy. And look, a really big thing is if word of mouth is what is the main contributor of growth to your business, there's nothing better you can do than providing really good service, white glove service, whatever you want to call it, and then they are more willing to, sing your praises the next time they meet with a business owner that, might mention, oh, my IT's, in shambles. Or they're more open to us then going to them and saying, hey, you mentioned to me that you just had a great experience. I was just thinking, just give me one or two business owners that you're really close with and make an introduction, right? And that's always been an obvious thing to do. But if you're really providing really good service and they feel a sense of closeness to you, they actually will do it.
Right, and I think having, and I think what sometimes I think a lot of MSP business owners don't realize is that sales can be service. I mean, I just think this concept, there's such a bias against the word sales, and I think you commented on it, like we hate the word upsell, we hate the word cross-sell. Yes, everybody hates, no one wants to be upsold. It's like if I wanted the French fries, I would have ordered the French fries. It's like, everybody hates those terms, but I think something we all need to realize is that part of looking after these relationships is having somebody whose day-to-day job it is about looking after the relationship. And that's not going to be, techs are going to react to tickets and problems and technical, security breaches, et cetera, but they're not going to be looking after the relationship. And so really, we use the term account manager to kind of simplify it, but it's really like a relationship manager, and they're the glue to the business principles. But let's, Steve, I just want to go to the Q&A log here, David, so we get a couple practical questions answered. But Steve says, sounds like the AM will not be producing any significant revenue for months, if not a year or more. How do you budget for the time spent learning the business? How do you see a fully trained AM producing once he or she is in the territory? So talk about kind of the life cycle and the ramp up of a new person in this role.
Right. So I don't see it as taking that long to produce new revenue because there is revenue to be had within the existing base. And I think that sometimes something that's missed is, like you mentioned in one of your slides, retention is a big deal, right? Cycling through clients. We just did an analysis internally. How much time do we spend in the first 3 or 6 months with a new client, onboarding and just kind of getting to know them and the nuances versus in year 2? And it's drastically different, drastically better in year 2. So retention, I see as some form of revenue creation. How you calculate that is a different story. But very often we will neglect making sure that we're pitching a certain thing to an existing client. So the revenue can be had right away, right? If you're doing reporting about things that are expiring and having account management meetings, we call them QBR, whether it's quarterly or twice a year. If you call them a QBR, they should be quarterly, but some clients want to meet more often, and other clients just don't see there being enough content to have a conversation in 3 months. But you need to make sure you have those things, because that's where a lot of the stuff is uncovered, something that they might not bring up to you, but while you're sitting there in front of them, they might mention something, and we could say, hey, back up, let's discuss that for a minute. So I think assuming there's a ramp-up period and it's going to, be on your dime during that period of time, that's not the way we necessarily look at it. We look at it as an investment in, like you said, creating a better relationship with the client. And then, I guess in some ways, the the new revenue piece, I don't want to call it gravy because that's way too light, but that's just another value that they're providing to the organization. It allows me and Paul to continue to go on more and more sales meetings. So calculating that is much more difficult than, say, you hire a salesperson and you got 3 months to ramp up, show me you have 5 clients in your pipeline, and you expect a 50% close rate, and then whatever the different steps are. Yeah, that's much more obvious. So we don't really track that stuff day to day. We do regular reviews with the account managers, see what they're going on. But if really your end goal is just new revenue right off the bat, you might want to rethink the strategy. I mean, I can understand why certain businesses might not be able to retain that employee if they're not generating new revenue. So this is not a one-size-fits-all type of thing, but I can tell you that the benefit will if it's the right person, the benefit will make itself evident pretty quickly in terms of freeing up your times and other things. Now, in terms of, you asked about compensation, which I could briefly mention. So an aspect, and I think maybe you had it in one of your slides, so if you want me to hold off, Ted, you can certainly tell me to.
Well, we're showing the. I mean, I moved forward to the next slide just to talk.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, to talk. I mean, I think a couple comments are in order. I want to kind of maybe just chime in a couple things. I mean, I'm showing a revenue cohort chart here, right? And just to kind of underscore the whole point that David just made, which is this business, we invest a lot of cost in the front part of the relationship, and the massive profits and cash flow in a client relation come later. And so you have to retain them. And so I think the question about, hiring an AM and where's the incremental revenue is the wrong question to be asking, because it's really about how am I going to maintain this client for 4 or 5 years? Because the huge profits that you're going to make in the relationship are going to come from like months 14 to 36 to 48, And so, when you bring on an account, I mean, I think another point about why account management is where you want to invest first is if you have a documented like tactical plan of what they're supposed to do, set up the QBRs, set up the VCIO engagements, be monitoring, whether we're having some sort of massive ticket explosion at a client because there's some sort of service issue and you need to go investigate maybe whether there's a satisfaction problem going on. This is all stuff where somebody doesn't need a PhD in managed services to go do. You can throw them into that, and they can ramp up in time and become an expert over time in the managed services business model. But it's really about looking after that base, and then the new revenue can come in the form of projects. It can come in the form of new technologies that maybe the client is now ripe for. They may be, growing tremendously, and there's lots of ads, moves, and changes, and their seat count's gone up a lot. So it's not about it's like the meat is the stable base of business, and the gravy is there as gravy. And I think, David, why don't you talk a little bit about how your comp plan works, because I think it highlights this point around that the meat is the recurring revenue and looking after it, and then there's the gravy, and you want to comp them on both.
Yeah. So I mean, first off, full disclosure, Ted and I did not speak before this because originally my business partner Paul was supposed to be on this call. But what he just said, I couldn't agree with more. He hit the nail on the head. That's really the way we see it. one of the things that we track, and then I'll jump right into the compensation, is how long a client's been with us. It's just a simple spreadsheet, and every time you open it, it does the formula. And I happen to know that we've increased our retention. It's at least by a year, the length of the contract, if not more. And we used to track turnover as well, or we still do, and that's much less. And there's no doubt it's because of that department. There's nothing more frustrating for a client than, I asked you to do this, it never got done, nobody ever followed through, and that leaves a bad taste in their mouth. And all it takes is, being in the elevator with some guy who's in IT or talking to their cousin at the holiday party, and then now they have one foot out the door. So it's a long-term strategy, which I guess can be challenging, but it is something that'll absolutely work if you have the right person in that position. And it's a lot easier to find that person than that unicorn salesperson. So going into the compensation, right, because you kind of want everybody to be motivated by being able to make more money. As Ted laid out here, there's a base salary, and then we give them a percentage of the monthly recurring revenue of that client. So that's motivation for them to just make sure that client's happy and satisfied. And then when they sell projects, there's a piece that they're compensated, or a different formula they're compensated on for hardware and software, and for the labor itself. And this is pretty much what Ted has on the screen, is pretty much what our compensation plan exactly is. The base can vary depending on the experience. And there's also a piece, actually, if they bring in new business, whether there's two types, whether it's business that we've handed to them, assigned to them, something that came in through the company, versus something that they develop fully on their own. So obviously they'll make a little bit more on that, actually significantly more on that, something that they've generated because they've acted like a true salesperson in that particular case. So that's, that gives them the ability to take it over the top. But it also, the way the compensation structure is, it's very balanced to make sure they're not neglecting the existing base and focusing just on new business and vice versa.
Exactly, and I think just the thing that everybody we should underscore on this is that if you look at this, the biggest component of their compensation is looking after the recurring revenue and making sure that the recurring revenue recurs, right? And I think there's, David, I don't know if you want to delve into this story more, but Paul was sharing, another thing that often happens with your clients is somebody new will come in. There's a new CFO in town, new sheriff in town, and sometimes it's somebody who doesn't have a relationship with you, and that can spell a disaster for a relationship if you're not managing it and you're not even aware of it. If you have 150 clients, it's kind of hard to keep track of all the musical chairs that will happen in the leadership of a company. And so maybe just talk about, how important having account management on task is if, new leadership comes into the client.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think you just said it. It's monumental, right? Very often when new managers that are involved in the IT, in whatever extent, they often want to make changes to show, hey, I'm here to provide value to the company, and IT is certainly an area that they might look at. And you want to kind of beat them to the punch and say, welcome to your company. We've been servicing them as a client for X amount of time. Love to get together with you and explain to you what we do, how we do it, things that we've seen. And then that usually takes, sounds weird, but it takes you off their radar in the sense, all right, I think we're good in the IT department. Let me focus on areas where I see weaknesses.
Exactly. So there's quite a large number of kind of questions. Okay, give us kind of like the Cliff Notes version of the job description of the network doctor account manager. What are the tactical things they're doing day in, day out?
So the qualities that we're looking for first and foremost is really somebody that's very organized, that's well-spoken, responsible, and has tremendous follow-up capabilities, or habits, I should say. I mean, that's really huge. You get that, And if you get that and nothing else, there's a tremendous amount of value in that. So that's what you want to look for. Technology background is nice, but sometimes less is more in the sense that they're not skewed. And we always make sure that we set the expectation. This is not your system engineer. This is somebody, if they can answer the question honestly, they will. If they can't, they know what channels to go to internally in our organization to get you the answer. In terms of the day-to-day activity, just starting with the QBRs, it is so critical to make sure that those things happen on a regular basis. We make sure, a cardinal rule here is when we do onboarding, one of the tasks is to schedule those QBRs. So in the third month of the quarter, the second week, fourth Friday, we're going to meet. And you basically send the client an invite for that so that it's a recurring appointment. It keeps you on track. It keeps them on track. Because when you say, hey, we're going to reach out, we'll email you to schedule the next appointment, I mean, it's not impossible to stay on your radar, but I've seen it very often than not where it just eventually falls off. And, when we're on a prospect meeting, they say, well, yeah, they were told us we were going to do QBRs or strategic meetings, and it just never happened. So that's something that's automated. It's in there. I get invited to those, or Paul gets invited to those if he's, the managing partner on it. And that's easy to do. And once that's set up, it's there. And if we need to move it up or back or cancel it, we can do that, but it's in the calendar. When we do those meetings, there needs to be an agenda prepared before the meeting that's sent to the client within 24 hours before the meeting. The agenda, the way it looks, is items that carried over from the last meeting, new items that we might be aware of or that the client wants to share with us. And then if there's nothing else to talk about, we come with a report of how many tickets have you opened in the last quarter and what our response times have been and what types of issues you're having. So if you're using, we use ConnectWise. If you're using that, you can manage the service types and so on, so they can see that stuff. And if nothing else, they see that and they feel, hey, you guys are on top of the stuff, and I feel good about that, and maybe you just start chatting about sports or whatever else you're interested in. And I think everybody knows that just having a good relationship is huge, probably more important than anything else.
And are there any special tools that are particularly vital in these meetings, in terms of like document? I think there's a lot of debate at these peer group meetings about, how do you show the value of managed services, right? It's if everything's going smoothly, sometimes the value equation gets a little lost. So are there special tricks of the trade you're using to make sure that value is surfaced and visible to the client?
Yeah. So we're using Bright Gauge for reporting. So that goes out proactively once a month with the gauges, like I said, open tickets, closed tickets, response times, type of tickets, inventory. The nice thing about IT is we're pretty consistent in terms of our challenges, right? A lot of people feel the same way. When we're doing a good job, nobody senses it. When we're doing a bad job, or the perception is that like everybody gets on your case about it. So there's that balance of drowning them with information and making our presence felt in a positive way. So providing them with reporting is positive. Having a newsletter that's not going out once a week, maybe going out once a month or once every 2 months. Hey, we're here, we're doing these things. Doing those meetings and showing, we always bring network diagrams to the meeting, and they see it, and 9 out of 10 times they don't understand it, but there's a certain comfort that they have knowing that somebody knows this stuff. I mean, I don't know how many out there have been on meetings, and you start to ask the prospect, what do you have, how many servers, what tools are you using, and either they just flat out say, we have no idea, or they give you some information. If you do end up signing them up and you go and do the onboarding and you see it's vastly different. Our philosophy is if we have the information, the client has the information.
Great. And I think if I remember back to that first conversation we had at the peer group meeting, and I think you just talked about it and you made it sound quite easy, but I know that this is one of the biggest challenges is that you have to sell and manage the client to get together? Because the tendency everybody has, we're all busy business people, and we often, like, you know, it's like getting to the dentist. It's like you need somebody to manage you, to take care of business. And so, I mean, I just want to underscore that I always have this joke that, like most QBRs, you can't call them QBRs because they ain't happening quarterly, but the reality is you really need to have process and you have to have ownership of staying on a cadence. And I think if we took a poll of everybody on this call today, we would find out that everybody is meeting with their clients less than they want to be or should be. And can you talk a little bit about that struggle a little bit more? You made it sound kind of effortless, but talk about that particular struggle of making sure you get clients to engage.
Yeah, so it kind of is, I don't want to call anything effortless, but if you have a process for onboarding, we have two types of onboarding, and they're two different, you know, projects managed separately. There's the account management onboarding, and then obviously there's the technical onboarding. Literally, one of the checklists is determine a day. And we say to clients, you know, who are like, well, I don't know what my schedule is, let's just get something in the schedule. Have it on your calendar. And then it just becomes a lot easier. And if a client keeps pushing it off, then the account manager kind of gets a sense of that after a while and says, you know, would reply back and say, hey, do you want to move these to you know, once every 6 months instead? But once it falls off the calendar, then it becomes really difficult. You're calling in the middle of, you know, you might call the client and say, hey, we haven't gotten together in a while, let's meet. Generally, if you're making that call, it's probably because you found out something where something might have got bumbled, or, you know, there's some strain on the relationship that you sensed and you needed to make that call. And then at that point, I'm not going to say it's too late, but at that point, you know, the client's kind of aware of that. Yeah, you're calling me now because, you know, we're not thrilled. But going to see a client when there's just nothing going on, or, you know, nothing on fire, so to speak, is really good, because then you can have kind of an open conversation, and sometimes they're really short, and that's fine. Right. And then sometimes you unfold something or unwrap something that you would have never known to ask under a different circumstance.
Right, and I think I'll just make one other comment, that I think the other thing we need to keep in mind is that, you know, as your clients get larger, as they get to 30, 40, 50, 60, 100 seats, you know, oftentimes your key point of contact may be a little bit out of the loop on what's all happening inside the account. And I just think that the cautionary tale here is that person may be super busy and pushing off the QBR or delaying the meeting, but you have this mountain of evidence of people using consumer-grade Dropbox in the workplace, and maybe data privacy being breached, and tickets, you know, issues, satisfaction issues here that your main contact may not even be aware of. So I think I love the concept of a quarterback in this sort of role, because you're orchestrating lots of different people, and it's important to keep that in mind, that account ownership is not just single-threaded through a single person, especially if you have larger clients.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, sometimes we'll bring, you know, look, if the, you know, essentially account management is created, whether it's your choice or the client's choice, right? So they're going to need a point of contact. How often you contact them is a different story, or you're in touch with them is a different story. But they're either going to make you the account manager, if it's not an official role, or they're going to make a tech that they've dealt with a lot the account manager, or maybe, you know, your office manager or your receptionist who picks up the phone. So they're going to create one regardless.
Right.
This is a way of preventing that all being on that one person, who will inevitably, if they don't own that process or embrace that process, they're going to forget to do things. So I think setting the expectation, I might not have all the answers, but I will make sure that I get it to the right person, but I'm your guy, is important. And that doesn't mean they can't have a relationship with anybody else, but there needs to be that fail-safe, which in our case is the account manager.
Okay, so David, before we dive into just the management of this team, just a quick question. Are you doing the VCIO type concept? Are you driving that? And how are you managing that, if you're doing it?
Yeah, we're doing it. So that's another important, I wouldn't say necessarily role of the account manager, But we do have VCIOs who are senior level system engineers, and they get invited into the process at some point. But the account manager needs to define the conversation, the subject first, right?
Right.
To have an engineer, VCIO, come in and just say, hey, talk to me, tell me what's going on, it's probably not the best use of people's time.
Right.
But if the account manager during their QBRs, and again, we'll just call them QBRs whether they happen quarterly or not, if they're saying, tell me about your process, where is there a challenge, and if they can't answer that, so that's a level of VCIO. VCIO, in my opinion, doesn't have to be one person, and then introduce somebody who's more familiar with that particular thing, and they're taking that VCIO role, to another level.
Exactly. I think it's like I've heard through the talking to people where they mix up VCIO and account manager. It's like in my view that's so different. It's like the skill set of the account manager type person, they are a generalist. They are a relationship person. They are driving a process. They're not going to have they're not a CIO type. And I mean, so VCIO is all about bringing subject matter expertise to the client in a timely and relevant fashion at the right moment. The account manager needs to know when to bring in the VCIO resource, but these are not the same person. These are not the same thing. And I'm hearing that get mixed up with a lot of MSPs, that they're kind of throwing, and a lot of VCIO people, the subject matter experts, senior tech, senior engineers, senior service manager type people, they're not the sort of people who are going to be good relationship people as well. So these things are really quite different. And it's really, back to today's thesis, the account manager quarterbacks that and brings in the VCIO resource when it's timely and relevant.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you 100%. We look at it as VCIO services, not VCIO in terms of a person, because if it's not the account manager, again, most of us have multiple system engineers, and everybody's got their own, niches and areas of expertise. So to expect an engineer to embody that role entirely is a pretty big challenge as well.
Right.
So look at it as a service and not necessarily a person.
Exactly. Okay, so let's tackle management. How are you managing your team of 4 account managers, and has your thinking evolved on that at all?
My thinking has evolved on it. We're managing right now, so I manage that team. We have meetings every week. That's, again, in the calendar, and it's firm, and we don't push it off unless there's extraneous circumstances. And we use Asana, which is a task list. Every time we have this meeting, we throw up, okay, where did we leave off last time? What are things that we need to do? We don't really spend too much time talking about a particular client or scenario unless there's something, an overall arching theme to learn from it. Those types of things we deal on a one-off basis, because to have everybody in the room to discuss one single client, one particular situation, is not the best use of everybody's time. And really, that's the main form of management. In terms of, are they at their quota? Are they, that's not so relevant here, versus, say, a traditional sales meeting. But you got to know what they're doing, right? So I happen to sit next to the bullpen with the account managers. We have an open door policy here, so if there's something that comes up, it's quick. It's a quick conversation. We have it right then and there. If it's something that's more lengthy, we might cut it off and say, okay, let's have a separate meeting. Is this something that we have to bring all the AMs in for, account managers in for, or is it something that, we can just have a one-on-one type of meeting? And then we do, semi-annual reviews, every 6 months, which is, more individualized, direct between them. And that's, obviously there's other management involved, but that's probably the more formal piece of it.
And how are you managing just kind of quota attainment and new projects that, I mean, how are you managing, is that ConnectWise and opportunities in ConnectWise? How are you just on a practical basis managing that?
Gotcha. So we're using ConnectWise. right? So the 2% of the revenue is, easy to see. I get a report before every payroll to see, the collective MRR for that account manager and what the compensation is as a result. So it needs to, be of a certain amount. Now remember, they don't necessarily have the ability to influence it as much as, say, a straight salesperson, but that's a much more difficult task, finding new business from scratch. So I keep an eye on that. If we lose a client, we'll know about that before we even see it necessarily on their, on their payroll. And we're really not talking about necessarily kind of one-off type of clients. We're talking about the monthly recurring clients that have full MSA. It's not like they have antivirus only, they have monitoring only. We're talking about something that involves service support, at the very minimum help desk support, and then anything else that stems off of that. Those are the types of things that we're keeping an eye on. And then any project or new business opportunities we use ConnectWise. I get a report weekly just to see what's in the pipe. We do discuss that briefly during our account management meetings. What do you have coming up? How realistic is that? And you need to balance the amount of data you want them to put into the system versus getting their job done. And that becomes more and more important as you grow. 4 people is more manageable than, say, if you had account management team of a dozen. My philosophy, the way that's changed on it, is maybe creating, again, same idea with account managers into salespeople, have one of the senior account managers become the team lead, and they're handling some of the day-to-day stuff for them, for their team, and then that removes me one step in terms of, the day-to-day activities, which is where I'm planning on going.
Gotcha. Okay, and you kind of addressed this briefly, so we only have time for just a couple more questions. So if anyone has a really good one, get it in there in the Q&A log. But Dana asked a question earlier, and you kind of touched on this briefly. But how do you determine the who gets what accounts, how many how much MRR is like an appropriate amount of revenue for a rep to carry? So it's really about how do you divvy up that work and what's the optimum kind of MRR load for a rep.
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's probably, of our whole process, that's probably the one that's least defined, process driven. There's much less automation in there, right? So I mean, what I use and Paul uses is kind of figure out who the client is, what they're about, industry and stuff like that, and really kind of figure out who's the best account manager for that role. And it's not always necessarily about making sure that everybody's even. If there's an account manager that's just better suited for a particular prospect for whatever reason, that's what you go with. And if their plate becomes full, you look at their existing base and say, okay, what are the things that you just need to shed? You have a $5,000 a month client, but now you're dealing with a $10,000 a month prospect. You're going to have twice the revenue there, so you're going to need to give up that $5,000 so that you can do your job properly. Because eventually, if it impacts them, they start losing clients, and that's not good for anybody. So I think that there's the human element that needs to go into that. And then in terms of how much, it's really, I think we can all say we've had clients that are 20 users that are like piece of cake, cupcake clients. And then you have ones that are just like they suck the life out of you. So I think that there's just an element of, some thought that you need to put into that. But if you're using basic stats, number of users and revenue is probably the best use. Really just those two things. Revenue is important because if you have that 20-person company, they're paying you $10,000 a month, and another 20-person company, they're paying $5,000 a month for whatever reason, right? You don't want to basically, those 20 users aren't created equally.
Right. And I think that just to underscore one thing that I've seen in my career is that it's okay to treat each account manager differently. There will be different levels of experience and talent and just productivity out of people. And you will have guys who will carry a bigger quota and have a bigger number, and they'll get a bigger pay packet. And that's okay. And so there's a lot of management judgment that goes into who owns what accounts. I mean, you want some philosophies behind it, but at the practical level, you want to load people up who are highly productive and doing an excellent job. and they're going to make more money, and that's an okay problem for them too, because they want to make more money. So
Sure.
maybe just one last question. We're kind of out of time, but I like this question that came in at the end, and this is another huge, we could do a whole webinar on this one, but how are you handling price increases for existing managed services clients?
So there's two reasons for prices to go up. Either it's time, and then prices go up because they've added different products. I think you're asking the first of those two, but in case you're asking the latter, products, you got to make sure when they get onto the invoice, do we open a ticket for the accounting department, it makes it to the invoice, and make sure it's properly billed. In terms of increases, what we do is we do an increase, or we look at increases every year. So we just look at effective rates of clients, see what they've added, if they've added products over time, and then determine, how many hours have we put in, which the effective rate will tell you, and then determine what kind of increase we want to do. And all of our agreements say, there's a reasonable increase that you might be eligible for every year, and you send them a note, give them 2 months before it hits. If you plan it properly, we found that people haven't fought too much. If you send the invoice, with the increase and say, hey, this month the increase hit, you probably be met with more resistance.
Right.
But
so you have a process around it, but you guys are going out and systematically raising prices at annual terms.
Yep.
Okay. Lots of MSPs aren't. That's why I asked. That's why I loved the final question. So having a process and having a philosophy, there is inflation in our economy, and it might be going up, and so your costs are going up, your labor costs are going up. You got to drive those price increases and have it be a part of the relationship. So,
exactly.
So with that, okay, we're out of time, everybody. Thanks a lot, everybody. We're a couple minutes over, but this was such a fantastic dialogue and conversation and so many great questions. Thanks for participating. And David Burke with Network Doctor, thank you for being my guest today.
My pleasure.
Okay, and everybody else, thanks a lot for spending some time with us today. Hopefully you took away some good information. This is Ted Hulsy with eFolder, signing off from another eFolder Partner Chat. Take care, everybody.